everyone, and welcome to Writing for Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
And joining us today is none other than TTRPG journalist and Rascal News co-founder, Rowan Zeoli. Rowan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about writing about role-playing games.
And thank you so much for joining us. As soon as we started this podcast, I was like, we need to get Rowan on this as soon as we can, because I very much value your perspective on the industry as a whole. And I'm really interested to see sort of what you have to talk about, especially as your role as a TTRPG journalist, as well as sort of what you've noticed from the industry itself, from your perch looking over it and commenting on it.
It's the fourth estate of TTRPG.
Exactly, yeah, my Statler and Waldorf little balcony that I just heckle from.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I think you are one of the few people I've seen in this space who also like goes into actual plays and like critiques them, or also goes into like games and critiques them. And like I said, I very much appreciate your insight on your critique. That's why I keep going back to Rascal News every morning to see what else you've come up with. So, audience, on Writing for Roleplay, we talk quite a bit about players writing for their characters, GMs writing for their campaigns, and performers writing for their actual plays. But we have a special opportunity today to speak with someone who writes about TTRPGs and the industry as a whole. So, Rowan, let's dive right in. For those who don't know who you are, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, as of right now, I'm Rowan Zeoli. Who's to say who I'll be in the future? But I am like you said, tabletop role-playing game and actual play journalist. I have had a real wild journey getting here. I have been a journalist for about 2 years now. I started off my career in writing in book publishing and book editing. And I founded an organization called Write Hive, which is a nonprofit organization that does workshops and annual convention completely free for marginalized writers. Anyone listening who is interested in writing fiction or nonfiction or any kind of prose, go check them out. They do some really great work. Through that, I decided I needed to do something fun and creative that was for me, so I started doing stand-up comedy. And as a trans person doing stand-up comedy in the current political climate, I was like, maybe not. That was kind of where I got my start in journalism. I did comedy journalism for a little bit. I would go to shows in Brooklyn and Manhattan and write reviews. I did a review of my friend's show at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Lucas Arnold, who's a big TikTok star. He's an incredibly funny comedian in his own right, and getting to talk about what that experience was like was really informative of being like, oh, I can like write about these really niche topics and talk about why they matter, what the experience is like. And that was my first taste of it. And so moving through comedy journalism into gender journalism, I wrote an article for Autostraddle about being a trans comedian. I interviewed a bunch of trans comedians about the experience of it. And from there, I moved into gender and psychedelics, which was a pivot because I made a pitch about gender and psychedelics and then got hired as a returning contributor for a site called Tripsitter. Wrote a lot of really interesting work there about the history of gender and psychedelics. Then moved into an investigation regarding amphetamines, and specifically Adderall and Vyvanse, and how people were saying that their medication was no longer as effective as it once was. Did some deep diving into that, realized it aligned with a patent exclusivity going up for a certain pharmaceutical company. And that whole path was intense because I was writing for a very small publication that did not have any support systems involved. So I got paid $300 to do a really deep dive investigation that took like 6 months, and was like, oh, I'm burnt out. Some really weird, sketchy things are happening to me. There was like a black van parked outside of my apartment for a couple days. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to shift into something else because this seems not it. And then I wrote about Dimension 20.
Oh my god, the pivot from gunning for the highest award in journalism, getting taken out by the CIA, to Dimension 20.
Exactly, yeah. So I wrote about, I pitched Charlie Hall at Polygon about Dungeons and Drag Queens, which was a really important piece of media for combining the already very queer tabletop space, but with the larger mainstream queer movement of people who love RuPaul's Drag Race, getting introduced to TTRPGs for the first time. And from there was like, oh, this brought me a lot of joy. I can write about things that make me happy and not deeply sad. Crazy. And so I started doing a lot of actual play work for Polygon. And then Lynn Kodega, my co-founder for Rascal News, got laid off from IO9, where they published maybe the most important piece of tabletop journalism that has come out in the last 5 years about the OGL crisis, and really shifted the entire landscape of like third-party Dungeons and Dragons publishers, which is a whole industry unto itself. And then IO9 still laid them off because journalism is in a really dire strait where venture capitalists are just buying up. They spent a lot of time buying up all these outlets and then could no longer afford them because they were like, but the number must go up. If number doesn't keep going up, it's not profitable. So we have to lay everyone off so number keeps going up. And that's not working for anyone. As we can see everywhere, SEO is awful. You can't go on Google to find anything anymore. AI is a really big nightmare. And so Lynn reached out to me and was like, hey, we got nothing else to do. Do you want to start a tabletop role-playing game outlet that we can own? And I was like, oh, I can own something? I've only ever worked freelance my entire career because I graduated college during the pandemic. And so I was like, all right, I'll just be a freelancer forever then. So having the idea that I could like have stake and own this company that brings me joy was really important to me. And then we brought in Chase Carter, who works for Dicebreaker, who is an incredible journalist, does a lot of really good labor reporting. And now it's been, as of this recording, almost 3 months of Rascal News, and we have put out 100 articles, a little more than that. Yeah, it's really crazy and is so fulfilling, and getting to report on people who are doing this because they love it so much, not because they are making a bunch of money, and then getting to report on the people who are making a bunch of money and being like, hey, you're doing some bad stuff here. It feels really valuable, especially in this time where I feel so helpless for the world at large. Being able to be like, in my little way, I can contribute to making the world a better place feels very important.
I mean, I love that. It also sounds very familiar, wouldn't you say, Kevin?
just a little bit, being like, man, there isn't a whole lot of work out there. What if we just do our own things? Sounds kind of familiar. Well, so Rowan, you mentioned Rascal News. That's your current big project. Can you tell us a little bit more about like Rascal News? Not only just like what it is and its mission, but also what it was like starting it up, especially in today's media landscape.
Yeah, so Rascal News is a independent, worker-owned, reader-funded tabletop journalism role-playing outlet. We started off it started in like November, December of last year, and we were trying to figure out what's the best way to go about it. We did initially go about trying to find a funder who originally was going to give us a bunch of money as a lump sum to kind of have ownership of it, but then we wouldn't have ownership of it. And we realized that sacrificing that ownership and that editorial voice and that perspective did not align with what we were trying to do with Rascal, because we describe ourselves as alternative, independent, and roguelike. We're changing every day. We're doing a bunch of things differently all the time. We also call ourselves ankle biters because we make people in power uncomfortable. And, you know, that's a good thing to be. But I think I've lost your question because I am just so deep in my love for Rascal.
Well, no, I mean, like, that's pretty much what I'm asking is, you know, just Rascal News is definitely your baby, of course, along with your two other co-founders. But it's really exciting to see this independent journalism space come out, especially in regards to the TTRPG industry. Like you mentioned, you know, IO9, you mentioned Dicebreaker, but from what I'm noticing from Rascal News is, like you said, that like ankle-biting journalism. Like, yes, you have your articles where you praise new games coming out, and folks at home, by the way, Rascal News also has a announcements lineup as sort of a. Can you tell us a little bit more about that as that service to the community?
Yeah, absolutely. So, speaking to the worker-owned journalism movement as well, we took a lot of inspiration from Defector, 404 Media, Aftermath, these really big, like, pinnacles, Hellgate, specifically New York journalism, these people who are owning their own work. The announcement section that we made as we were building this up was very much this idea of, we're only 3 people. We are not going to be able to cover the gamut of the industry as much as we want to. And there is not a place for so many people in this industry to find an audience, because we're an oversaturated industry, because there is a very high supply of people making things. There is also a high demand of people wanting things, but they're all siloed and funneled into the big titles. This goes for tabletop role-playing games, this goes for actual plays. Everyone goes to the big names that they recognize. And the outlets that exist currently have to go by SEO, and so those big names are the things that bring in traffic. Our announcement section is a way to kind of combat that. We don't have to do the work of writing up an article for everyone. We have a free to access and free to submit to announcement section where anyone who has a project in the tabletop space can submit it to us. You can send an email to press@rascal.news and we can set you up with a contributor account where you can write up your own press release. You can tell people about what's going on. We, of course, have to check it to make sure you don't say something heinous in the press release that you put out. Fortunately, we have not had to deny anyone a post yet because the people who are in our community are, for the large part, good people. And so being able to have that space that is free to access, a lot of our other articles are members only, which means you can sign up for a free account, or paid articles where you have to have a paying subscription to read the articles. You can also purchase an article individually for $1 to $3, depending on the level of investigatory work that went into it. But having a free section where anyone can go, oh, what's happening in the tabletop space? And then look at this announcement section and go, oh, here's a new game. Here's a casting call for a new show. Here's a new season of a show that I really love. Here's a game that I never would have heard about before because discoverability in the space is so low. But I found this new game by a niche author that I've never heard of before and can fall in love with it at absolutely no cost to you. So having that balance of free to access and also making sure that we can pay our rent is something that's really important to us in navigating.
It's like the job board in the tavern, where you can see all of the news and announcements and bounties available to you. I mean, the internet has created this democratization of media, which is awesome, but it has also created like a supreme decentralization, which does have the downside of it's really hard to find something because it's scattered. So I love that you have put up a lighthouse beacon to everybody of like, hey, if you want to debut onto the scene or something or make an announcement, come here. It's like Lady Whistledown's pamphlet in Bridgerton in so many ways, or like the old magazines, before they started dying. I love it.
Another big thing that the internet democratization has done is it has created this expectation between audience and creator where people are expecting things for free and don't understand the labor and costs that go into making those things. And people in the TTRPG space are always talking about making sure that people get compensated for their labor. But rarely do they consider where that money is coming from. And in other publications, those monies come from sponsorships or ads. And that significantly impacts the editorial purview of what those magazines and outlets can cover. And so by having a reader-funded outlet, you are directly funding the work without having the ads, without having like that little reader little slit right there where you're scrolling through a website and you're like, oh, here's an ad, here's an ad, here's an ad, here's an ad, and here's a paragraph. And I have to scroll through the entire article in this little window surrounded by ads the whole time. And so re-establishing that expectation of labor for compensation is something that a lot of these worker-owned outlets are trying to reestablish within the news media. Because like you said, the fourth estate, journalism is so essential to a functioning society. But journalists are people who need to eat and sleep in a home. So it's a hard, late stage capitalism is a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you said it. Yeah, I mean, it's like for example, because I come from the TV world, which has been rocked the last few years by streaming and all of that. And the expectation of all of this content for low cost, it's just unsustainable. The reason that broadcast worked so well for so long is because that ad creates content. It also creates advertiser-friendly content. You can't say shit on CBS because it's vulgar. You can say it on HBO because HBO is funded by subscribers and also like merch sales for Game of Thrones now. So yeah, it is very yes, I totally agree with you. People need to understand if you want completely independent, free, creator-owned, you have to pay for it. That needs to be sustainable.
So you mentioned earlier, Rowan, you started out with a lot of like deep dive journalism up until you had black fans hanging outside your window, and then you pivoted, and now you're in the journalistic space for tabletop RPGs and the actual plays and the community at large. What was it about the TTRPG industry and those spaces that kind of drew you into that pivot? Like, besides just the black vans, like, what was it that's like, all right, I'm going to go this direction now?
Yeah, so like I said, the fun and joy of writing about Dimension 20 was a big part of it for me. But also, I started following the work of Dr. Emily Friedman, who is a scholar in the space, does some really incredible work. And that was the moment that I realized, like, oh, writing about this niche art form is valuable because it reflects things about our larger culture. It reflects things about the world that we live in, because art is not made in a vacuum. It always is made in response to the goings on of the world around it, whether that's thematically, technologically, community-wise. All of these things influence the way things are made. Like we talked about when we just started recording, the tabletop government-sponsored war game that was played to predict what would happen in the result of a second Trump's presidency on NATO's navigating of global conflict.
It's like Ender's Game.
Literally.
So real quick. I believe we mentioned that right before we started recording.
Yeah,
Yeah,
prior to recording.
Okay, cool. So,
but that kind of like understanding of, oh, this microcosm that we exist in, that so many people have kind of pushed to the side as in like, oh, this is just games, this doesn't matter, this has no real impact on the world at large. I realized that was bullshit. I realized that didn't make any sense. I can say shit here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, we can say shit.
Yeah, all of that really influenced me and made me realize, oh, this has larger implications because we exist in an interconnected world. And the thing that was so inspiring to me about the tabletop space was how nascent it is, was how still developing it is, because Dungeons and Dragons is celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. Actual plays have only existed for 20 years at most in their current form. And so unlike other more established mediums like film or theater or like novels, people are still figuring out what this space gets to look like. We can understand what our relationships to labor and community ownership are, and what our responsibility as members of community are, and what it looks like to hold large players and bad actors accountable, how we do that poorly, how we do that well, how we can change the way we do that to model a world that we want to live in. Because tabletop games, more than any other artistic medium, in my opinion, are actively engaging in the craft of world building every time you sit down at the table. You are constantly imagining a world that is similar and dissimilar to your own. And if we can harness that power and that imaginative, generative idea into our own real life and go, oh, I don't have to just do this when I'm rolling dice. I can do this in every interaction I'm having with people. I can do this in every way that I'm moving through the world. I can do this by unionizing my workplace. I can do this by going to a protest. I can do this by holding the people of power accountable, figuring out how to be the hero in your own life in real, actionable, tangible ways. That's what drew me to writing about tabletop games, because I feel like without that kind of critical writing, it's real easy for those thoughts to just kind of get lost in the wind.
I love that. And that's a common refrain on our podcast as well. Kayla and I will mention that art cannot by its nature be non-political, or rather, like, all art is political in some sense. Even the simplest stories have some sort of political element drawn from your own perspective on the world. And it is refreshing to read articles on like the games and the industry that keeps that in mind. Especially your article analyzing that UK war game. That was I'm sorry. I love that article so much because it starts out with like, hey, this war game is making headlines that like the UK is like, yeah, through this war game, we've determined that if Donald Trump becomes president, then all of this stuff will go down. So you should give us more money. And then you start analyzing the actual mechanics of the game as a game itself. By the way, we've mentioned this article enough. We're going to put a link in the show notes, folks. If you want to read it, definitely check it out.
It's interesting how you're talking about like TTRPG is still so new and it's still so developing. And I tell Kevin this all the time. I'm like, we're in the 70s of Hollywood with TTRPG right now. Like, the things that are happening, the things that we're discovering, the way that people are buying in, taking these huge risks, this audience is growing. I mean, you talk about film being like an older art form. It's only about 100 years old, really. It's still so new in comparison to novels or plays. But yeah, RPGs are so much younger, and it is really exciting to be, you know, like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas at USC and the ground floor of all of this, and like the sky is the absolute limit. Who knows where we will go? It is super exciting.
Absolutely. No, it's very much like, I don't know, it's just the idea of being like, oh, in 30 years, if the world is still around, J Dragon is going to be a pinnacle of the art form. Is going to be like, oh, here is a name that has influenced the way this entire medium has gone. But right now, J Dragon's, you know, just a person making some games who like has some notoriety in our very little niche industry.
I feel like some sort, like, however the expats in Paris felt, you know, with their little berets and their cigarettes talking about art and the meaning of life. That's us sitting around talking about rolling dice and painting minis and stuff.
Quite literally.
The amount of times I talk about J Dragon's Wander Home without actually having played that game, like I can read through that book and be like, oh, there's a lot of really cool stuff here, even though I haven't actually sat down at the table to actually play through it. That's fascinating to me in and of itself.
Be careful, you're going to start some discourse about whether reviewers have to play games or not.
So we're talking about the broader industry as a whole here, and I'm kind of curious, are there any trends in the industry that you've noticed that you think the wider public should be aware of, or even any predictions on where you think the industry, whether for, you know, tabletop RPG publishing or the actual play space, like where you see it going?
I'll talk more to the actual play world just because that's more of where my knowledge sits. I think the actual play space is in this really interesting liminal zone, like you were talking about just before with the 70s Hollywood, where there are people who have made their whole careers, at least publicly facing, surrounding actual play. They have made this kind of like studio system of actual play. You have your Critical Roles, you have your Dimension 20s, you have the Adventure Zones, Acquisitions Incs, etc., etc., etc. You have these pillars of the industry that have now made a home for themselves. You also have what Dr. Emily Friedman refers to as the industry's ambitious middle, where it is a bunch of people who are not necessarily like trained in the medium, because there's what training is there, because it's like a mishmash of improv and drama and playing games and video editing and audio editing, all of these things, who don't have any financial backing but have really strong artistic intentions and are using the aesthetics and techniques that they have available to them to create some really beautiful art. And so we're existing in this weird semi-professional, semi-hobbyist space right now where people, actually, Dr. Friedman is currently doing a survey right now trying to figure this out. I just did an interview with her like a couple weeks ago about how people view themselves. Do they view themselves as professionals? Do they view themselves as wanting compensation? Do they view themselves as owning their art? How do you relate to the art that you create? Because again, this idea of it's all free, it's all available to access for whatever, the idea of like being an indie filmmaker is different from being an indie actual player. And I think for the future of where the medium is headed, I think we're going to see a development of really codified subgenres. We're going to see our live streams that kind of continue where it is, there's then the subgenres within live streams of people who just like, I just want to play a game with my friends and I'm going to hop on and then like we'll record it and stream it on Twitch for like 7 people and that's whatever. Then you also have live streams like Transplaner who are building up their own kind of like media ecosystem, and they have a whole bunch of shows and they're doing their first in-studio show. You have like Happy Jack's RPG, which has been doing this since 2009, and they have a very like cemented formula with a lot of really solid production value. But then you have your like edited side, like you have your Dimension 20s, you have more indie outlets like My First Dungeon and Queen's Court Games for the All Night Society that are really honing into the artistic narrative element of it more so than the gameplay element of it. And so we're going to see, as things get more defined, that people understand what type of actual play they're doing. And hopefully eventually we'll get to a place where someone can say the word actual play And you won't have to go, what's that? And then you have to go, where someone makes a story, an improv story through playing a tabletop role-playing game. And then they'll be like, wait, what's that? And they'll be like, like Dungeons and Dragons. Like, it's going to take some steps to get there, but I think we are really seeing the mainstreaming of both tabletop games and actual play very rapidly, like with Encounter Party at the Dungeons and Dragons Adventures channel. And then you also have the really not great ones. Like me and Lynn wrote a really cutting review of 20-Sided Tavern. That's currently the off-Broadway show. That is, you can go read the review because I don't have to say all the mean things I think here. But you're seeing that companies are now understanding that there is money behind this industry, that there are people who are willing to donate to crowdfunding and willing to put $11 million to make Critical Role's Legends of Vox Machina campaign into an animated show. So capitalism of it all is like, oh, how can we take this folk art medium and turn it into something for mass consumerism? And as much as I'm an anti-capitalist, I don't think that making something that people want to watch is a bad thing. But I do think that it has to be done with artistic integrity and care for both the people making it and the people watching it.
That's the business of art, show business, is always just teetering on a tightrope of we have to make money, but also it's art. It should be art. It should have integrity, and it can't just be this schlock. And you get like these studios, they'll put out, Fast and Furious 13 million or whatever. And then everybody will be like, oh, Hollywood is dying. Everything is remakes, etc., etc. But then Universal can take that money and they can use it to, they'll throw it at Blumhouse or whatever. So Blumhouse can make a horror picture for $1 million that is one of the most incredible things we've seen in the last several years or something. Like, you do need these like big massive popcorn things that draw in a whole bunch of money so that people can make artistic things. But yeah, it's a hard line to walk. And I mean, I'm sure Shakespeare had the same problems of like, I need to make a crowd pleasing raunchy comedy or whatever so that I can have money to make, I gotta make her look good in this allegory. So Romeo and Juliet will be those emotional Italians that can't keep their shit together or whatever, like
as an emotional Italian, I get it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
For our audio only audience, Rowan did do the hand gesture.
The hand gesture. But yeah, it is it's fascinating to sort of see how this is going to develop, especially because RPG does feel so intimate, coming from a really indie space. It does feel like so many of Critical Role is still creator owned, and the parasocial relationship between critters and Critical Role is fascinating. And I mean,
you get to pay for more access to that parasocial relationship with their independently owned service. Yeah.
And I mean, it's insane because it's like, how do you also then become a casual fan of Critical Role? Because either you spend 4 hours a week watching people play Dungeons and Dragons, or you don't. Like, there's so much investment in time and thus so much investment in emotion that you do get these incredibly intense parasocial relationships with like the Dimension 20 fandom and the Critical Role fandom, and then these smaller indie people. Like, where do you draw the line? How far do you go, et cetera, et cetera. So it'll be quite interesting to see how it continues to go.
You also have the difficulty there of that parasocial relationship of people not being able to understand criticism of their blorbos.
Yeah.
Like, I wrote a piece about Dimension 20's Madison Square Garden show, about their relationship with Ticketmaster, and how there is some, like, complicated nuance of a very anti-capitalist brand navigating working with a monopoly, the very thing that they are very supposedly and very vocally against. And they're my blorbos too. I love Dimension 20 so much. And so now my position as a journalist has to be like, hey, like, I love you guys. I love what you stand for. Here's a bad thing that you did. And another part of the journalism ecosystem that has really become tainted has very much been this idea that any criticism is bad because all of the pieces that people are putting out are exclusively talking about the great things that everyone is doing. And you need to have both. You need to have the celebration. You also need to have the criticism.
Yeah, if you're going to take TTRPG seriously as a art form and medium, and I think that we all should. That's what we're all here for. You need to lend it also the legitimacy of criticism, of nuance, of, you know, you don't need to support everything that they do wholesale because you love them. Like, they're not your friends. They are a media company. It's okay to be like, I didn't like that, etc. Nobody's over here like, well, I was going to say is over here saying you can't criticize Disney, but Disney adults do exist. So,
Yeah.
you know,
They super do.
at the same time, the problem is, I think that we have so much created, like, media consumption has become so much a part of our identity that people sort of take criticism of media as criticism of themselves. And
That's what happens when you don't have community. You need to everyone build up community around you so that way you care about the people in your life and not the companies that feed you media.
Mhm.
Yep, 100%.
You know, it's interesting.
Evan,
too,
you had a
because-
thought like 3 points ago. Yeah.
Well, we're talking about how TTRPGs are a nascent industry, and we're talking about how for TTRPGs and actual plays to be taken seriously, there is a need for that criticism along with the praise. And I'm realizing that this exact thing happened with the video game industry like a few years back. Like, I remember, I think it was like the late aughts, early 2010s, there was the big, like, are video games art debate? And the answer is yes, of course. But with that discourse, you know, it's like, all right, we want video games to be taken seriously as an art form, but as soon as that, like, popular criticism of video games came about, suddenly there was a big reaction of like, well, hang on, video games are our safe space. Video games are where we're just, like, relaxing and we don't have to think about politics and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it's very interesting to see.
It's like, oh, are you really thinking that when you're shooting a bunch of people in Call of Duty? Yeah. Are you thinking it's not political?
God. Well, and that's the
It's
point.
literally
they
a
don't think
recruiting
about
tool. Yeah.
it. But no,
Sorry, I just got real heated when you said that.
Yeah. Well, no, it's so interesting to see those parallels of the cultural conversation. Like, video games have definitely now very much grown as an industry, and they're very much part of the mainstream. But I remember a time when, like, video games were of that, like, oh, only, like, the geeks who seek them out actually play video games. And now we're kind of at that point with TTRPGs, where it's like there is a bit of a buy-in with TTRPGs. You do have to do your own research. And like you say, the information about the space as a whole is very scattered. But as the industry grows, and speaking of the Legend of Vox Machina earlier, I think the Kickstarter raising a bunch of money for a series that is now on Amazon Prime Video was a big event that opened a lot of people's eyes to this space as a whole, especially the people in the suits who are like, wait a minute, we can mine this for IP.
Well, just and a quick note on that, because I was there when it was written, Gandalf. They had said, like, in that Kickstarter video, we went around, you know, because they've been working in the animation space for so long, you know, Sam Riegel is a director, etc. They went around to people they knew in the animation industry to pitch it as like a special, like a movie kind of a thing. And they got no. So they're like, all right, well, let's see if we can kickstart it. And the original thing was just a 40 some odd minute special, you know, for $750,000, I think, was what they were, like, going for. And no company wanted to give them that. And then the critters gave them $11 million by the end of the... I mean, it was... that goal was reached within like an hour or something. Like, their initial goal was reached so fast. And then, yeah, the 11 million by the end of it, and everybody's picked up their heads and was like, hold up, wait a minute. You guys were right. There is a market for this. We want in, you know, and that was, but it's like, yeah, no, they tried to go this, like, traditional route and it didn't work. So then they made it themselves. And then the studios were like, okay, like, let's get in on this. So it'll be, I mean, the D&D movie did, like, okay, but it is considered, like, a box office failure. So we are still kind of in an interesting, like, what is working, what isn't working, how much is mainstream, how big can you go and it'll still be viable, etc.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult. And I think your comparison, Kevin, to the video game space is really apt, because like we're seeing right now in the video game space, it blew up so much and now it's collapsing because all these venture capitalists put billions of dollars into the industry and are now doing all these layoffs because they don't want to wait 7 years for a beautiful piece of art to come out.
It's insane because, like, when you spend money on a video game and it takes time and then it comes out, I mean, people go insane for it. Like Baldur's Gate 3 took forever. Everybody loves Baldur's Gate 3. Like,
it's like the most successful thing Hasbro has done. Like,
and it's the same thing with Hollywood. Like, Hollywood does not immediately, like, most shows and movies were profitable in the aftermarket. TV shows were profitable after 100 episodes already, when you could put them on syndication. Cult classics became profitable when the DVD sales would rake in over 10 years. But yeah, Wall Street, number has to go up right away.
Number has to go up.
And it's insane to just see the way that Wall Street got in on these industries that have been fairly successful and sustainable for decades, doing what they did well in an established, sustainable way. And then they're just like, no, we're gonna shake things up and be disruptors. And it's like, no, that's bad.
But the video game, there was a piece in 2014 that came out called New Video Game Journalism that has some of the most like powerful video game journalism pieces that really influenced the way people wrote about video games. We created our own version of that on Rascal called the New Tabletop Games Journalism, where we collected a bunch of pieces from around the journalism space, from academia to journalism, to be like, here are people who are thinking about games, tabletop games specifically, in this really thoughtful and nuanced way, and evoke a lot of emotion while doing so. And so you bringing up this comparison to the way the video game industry is so apt, because that's how Rascal is viewing our entire model of like, that is the same place that we come from. Chase did a lot of video game journalism in the mid-teens before Gamergate and the whole collapse of all of that going on. And so it'll be interesting to see if the community of tabletop games, which is a lot more inherently social, a lot more inherently connected because you need other people to play tabletop games, if the like progressive community foundations of this new generation of tabletop players shifts the potential future of what this industry could look like as it solidifies from a community to an ecosystem to an industry.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how a community which seems to, and I mean, maybe that's just the loudest portion, but seems to be full of a bunch of anarchist socialists, deals with, well, we live in a late stage capitalism, so...
I mean, we say that this industry is full of anarchist socialists, and then some Warhammer 40k news comes out about like, oh yeah, they established that women are in this organization. Everyone's like, that's against the lore.
Yeah, it is. There is, I think, a very interesting sort of deep divide in general, in nerdy spaces in general. You do get a huge spectrum of people being like kind of on the right or kind of on the left, you know. I mean,
but then that's you get that reflection of the larger ecosystem, like I was speaking to before, how tabletop games is a microcosm of our larger society. You get that spectrum that you were speaking to because that spectrum exists in our larger culture, and the pole opposites of those spectrums are getting more vocal and getting louder and getting more militarized and organized. And I am included in that part of the left side of the spectrum where I am very vocal and very adamant about like fascism bad. But I think
fascism bad.
Fascism bad. Hot take. Fascism bad.
I will side with Indiana Jones on this. He's a problematic guy, but you know, he did punch Nazis, and I agree with that. I agree with fascism bad.
I'm a single issue voter, and it's punching Nazis. That's
So
yeah, I was just gonna say, like, because role-playing games are so steeped in sci-fi fantasy, and sci-fi fantasy has been wrestling with this for the longest time. You know, we were talking about Lord of the Rings and the Divine Right of Kings, or we mentioned Ender's Game. Fascinating subject right there, Ender's Game, and if to the audience, if you haven't read Ender's Game and you don't know who Orson Scott Card is, get into that. It is interesting. It totally,
I have no idea
totally
what
not political.
Orson Scott Card rises from their grave and is just like, wait, hang on. No,
He's
this
not
isn't gay,
dead.
guys.
Kevin, he isn't dead.
What? He isn't?
Orson Scott Card is alive.
That's news to me, actually.
Unless I find out right now that Orson
fact-checking.
Scott Card... 90% sure this guy is still alive.
He's still alive.
Yeah, he's 72.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Orson Scott Card is still alive.
He's young enough to be president.
Orson Scott Card is still alive, and Orson Scott Card has been teaching like writing workshops for decades and decades and decades. Like,
let's not talk about the CIA and the Iowa's writers' workshop.
Just, I mean, like, you know, so this is not anywhere new. And I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin was writing incredibly like groundbreaking sci-fi in the 80s and 90s about like, hey, what if there's a planet with like a completely different concept of gender than what we have? And this was decades ago, and we're still having these same conversations about like, oh, I don't want gay people kissing in Star Wars. And it's like,
it is interesting to go to like Star Wars Land and Disney World and then go to like the section of the gift shop that they have for like the stormtroopers and the First Order. And it's like, here's a bunch of like propaganda posters for the First Order. And it's like, okay, I think this is fine. This is like, we know what they're based off of. We know they're the bad guys.
My media literacy is going off a little bit right now.
I mean, oh, geez, I could go on to Star Wars, but speaking of interesting choices for a commodification, the people that got Death Eater tattoos, I always found to be
fascinating choice, and that's what we'll say on that. Moving on.
So,
wizard Nazis.
Let's lean a little bit away now from the like the greater industry
Come
speak
back.
and the our waving our flags of fascism is bad. And just Rowan, this question is more for me than for the audience, because I genuinely want to know here, what are some of your favorite TTRPGs? Like, if you were to recommend like 3 to 5 RPGs, what would they be?
Okay. Love Blades in the Dark. That's always my like go-to. I just love Blades in the Dark. A really fun one is Trash Pals. It's a very small game. It uses the Caltrip core system, uses only D4s. You play, as the title would suggest, as little tiny creatures, either like a stray cat, a possum, a raccoon, or a fox. And your goal is to find trash and bring it back to your family. And you face certain obstacles. You have to make sure that you are not getting noticed by humans or dogs or other things while you are searching for your trash. And your motivations for why you get trash are fourfold. There's hungry babies, trash for the trash gods, pure chaos, or my reasons are my own. And it's just delightful. Another good one is, I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic? Love that. Love a world building game where the title is just, I'm sorry, did you say Street Magic? And you are walking through a neighborhood piece by piece, trying to build up neighborhoods, locations, and residents of this place. And then you're putting events that change this world as you go along. I actually wrote a piece recently for our Lay It on the Table series, which is an exclusive series for our party level subscribers, $12 a month or $120 a year, where you can read about how I was feeling during the ongoing student encampment protests against the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where I was like, okay, well, if we're trying to think about how to build a new world, what better way than to play a world building game and be like, what are the things that make me think about what could be better, what is wrong with this world, what are people's motivations, and kind of my
not
thought
unlike the UK war game strategy
Exactly.
of how do we play out this scenario? Let's play a board game.
It all ties together.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, Rowan, once again, you mentioned Rascal News. Is Rascal News currently running any sort of event or drive going on? Me started giving you the on-ramp to your plug.
What a segue.
Beautiful. Seamless. So yes, I believe at the time of this airing, Rascal will be having our pledge drive. We're trying to raise enough funds for our ongoing subscribers. If you are going to be joining as a subscriber to Rascal News, now would be a great time to do it. Our goals are to try and make it so that way the three of us can have a livable wage, because currently we do not. But we're doing it anyway. We're going for it. We are going to be trying to get enough funds to have freelance contributors to try and expand the voices on Rascal, because an important element that we are like so hyper aware of is the fact that despite the fact that 3 of us are queer, 2 of us are trans, we are all still white writers and bring a very specific perspective to anything we write about, and really want to bring on contributors of color and make sure that they are ingratiated into our worker-owned structure and not just be like, you're freelancers, we'll hire you for 1 article and then you're out of here. Trying to figure out how to make that an equitable structure so that way they still have a vested interest in the company as a whole and like feeling proud of the organization that we are making. We have a bunch of stretch goals that we're trying to meet. And yeah, if you have $5 a month to give to a little worker-owned tabletop role-playing game journalism outlet, please subscribe, because it will help us keep doing it and help the industry continue to grow and develop in a way that feels ethical.
Love it.
We love that. We love ethical journalism. We love ethical, sustainable business practices. And if you do too,
If you don't believe me,
Yeah.
read the ethics and standards on our website, which is far too long and really in depth. And I may be hyper focused on it a little bit, but it's really good.
Well, Rowan, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an incredible conversation, and honestly, I've learned quite a bit, and audience, I hope you've learned something too. If you want the latest in tabletop RPG news, be sure to check out Rascal News. We'll have a link in the show notes, as well as a link to that article we kept talking about during this episode. Seriously, still one of my favorites, Rowan. And by the way, speaking of supporting independent media, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. Follow us on social media. We got the links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content like extra episodes, access to the private Discord, etc. Be sure to check it out. Rowan, thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
thank you so much, Rowan. This has been fascinating.
Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff.
This week it is sending emotional support memes to Kevin.
We post.
Be on the lookout for those, Kevin.
I look forward to them. We post a new episode every Tuesday, so until then, see you next week.
Bye.